Let's open our Bibles, if you would. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 2 tonight. Daniel chapter 2, continuing with our study of this wonderful work of prophecy. It starts off, we're going to jump right in, got 49 verses, so can't mess around. But it says, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. And his spirit was troubled, so his sleep left him. So it wasn't just he had a bad dream. He had dreams, it says. There was a number of them. And it says in his second year, and there's some critics that will point to that because we saw last week where they were in the third year, but there's a Babylonian reckoning of the king's reign versus the Jewish reckoning. And this was the Babylonians. They didn't count the initial year of reign, as we saw. And it says the king gave the command to call all the magicians, the astrologers, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. And so they came and stood before the king. So there was this great gathering of wise guys. You know, all of the men who had titles, and they all had the robes and the pointy hats with the stars on them, and the wands, and you know, they looked like refugees from Harry Potter, but they acted like, if you can remember, the Keystone Cops. So just kind of have those two images in your mind as we go through it. The magicians, this comes from a word that means an engraver, because they would write in their secret books, kind of like with Dr. Strange, you know, in their library. They had these books that only certain people could look at, and they would write their secret spells and everything in a book, or in those days they would engrave them in a clay tablet or whatever the medium would be. The astrologers also, the same word is used to translate as necromancers or enchanters. So these guys were into some kind of really weird juju. And then the sorcerers, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, when the New Old Testament was translated into Greek, that word is the word pharmakos, where we get our word pharmacology or pharmacy, and it means drugs. And they would use drugs for the purpose of working their spells. You know, they would get their mojo going on people through the drugs. And so these are the three guys. And then the Chaldeans were kind of like a Babylonian priestly class of people. And they were all brought in to tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream is all about. And so he says to him in verse 3, I've had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. And so the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. It's kind of interesting from the beginning of the quotes there, after the word Aramaic, and you see it's in quotes, from that part, the second half of verse 4 in chapter 2, all the way to chapter 7, verse 28, is going to be written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, as the rest of the most of the rest of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. But this section is written in Aramaic, which was, you could say, that was the language of the world. That was the Gentile language of that day. And what's going to be happening in the next 5+ chapters is going to be specifically for the Gentiles. And so they were, this is what I would, what was going on here is what I would deem as the dream game. You know, the king would have a dream, and he'd call all his guys in to interpret it for him. And so they said in verse 4, O king, live forever. Tell the servants, your servants, the dream, and then we'll give you the interpretation. You know, we know how to do the dream game. We've been doing this a long time. You tell us what it is, and then we'll interpret it for you. And the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. Now, if you got the old King James, instead of that, it says, the thing is gone from me. And it kind of sounds like, oh, I can't remember what it was. You know, it was a bad dream, but I can't remember what it was. That's not what it says in the Greek. And this is a literal rendering in the King James, but what it means is, it comes from a word that means command or word. It's an Aramaic word that just means, I've said it, so let it be written, so let it be done. And so he says that my decision is firm. And if you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, I'm going to cut you into pieces. And your houses shall be made an ash heap. Or old King James says a dung heap. And however, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, then I'll give you a bunch of gifts and rewards and great honor. So therefore, you tell me the dream and the interpretation. Now this wasn't one of those dreams where you find yourself in the mall in your Fruit of the Looms, and everything's going in slow motion and you're trying to get away and you can't. It wasn't. I mean, this was even worse than that. This was a really, really bad dream. Every time I use that illustration, everybody looks at me blankly, like you've never had that dream. Uh, yeah, right. But this is the dream game. They're saying no. That king. Here's what they say: let the king tell his servants the dream, and then we'll give you the interpretation. We've been doing this. This is just your second year on the throne. We worked for your dad. We've been doing the dream game a long time. This is how it works. We know you're young and you're kind of inexperienced, but you just tell us what the dream was, and then we'll interpret it for you. And it's very much like some of the traveling prophets that we have today, where they go around from church to church, and then they start asking people questions. They come up and speak, and then they call people up and they start prophesying over them, and then they leave. Kind of the same. That's the modern new dream game. But it says the king answered and said in verse 8, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there's only one decree for you. For if you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the time is changed, therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. He's saying we're not going to play. That's the old dream game. We're going to do a new dream game now, and we're going to test you to see if you really are able to do some razzle-dazzle. So you can not only give me the interpretation, but tell me the dream first. And so they answered and said, there's not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such a thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It's a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with us. Who do you think we are? The psychic detectives? We don't do that. That's not how it works. You got to tell us, and then we'll give you the answer. And so for this reason, verse 12 tells us that the king was very angry. And he was angry and very furious, is what he was, which is worse than being angry. And he gave the command to destroy all the wise guys of Babylon. Notice the word men is in italics, so it's literally not wise men, but it's wise guys. And so the decree went out, and they began killing all the wise guys, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Now, here's a question that sometimes comes up. Where was Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego here in chapter 2, when the decree first went out and he called all these guys together? He called all the magicians and the soothsayers and all those guys, and he says, give me the interpretation of the dream. Where was Daniel and his homies? Well, they didn't play games. They didn't go to this sort of a thing because the decree had gone out, come and tell me the interpretation of this dream and I'll make you rich. They weren't into that. They weren't going to play that. And so they just weren't part of that first go-around. And then verse 14 says, with counsel and wisdom, Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. The captain of the king's guard, there are some guys that say that should be translated the king's executioner. He was the guy that would go cut them into pieces and then make their houses an ash heap. And so he answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent? And then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So, Daniel said, what's all the big deal? Why are you getting ready to go around and kill all my friends? They were Gentiles. They were non-believers, but Daniel was one of them now, and he'd gotten to know him. He said, what's going on? And so Arioch told him what the deal was and how the king was not only angry, but also angry and very furious. And so Daniel went to his house, verse 17, and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, his companions. So those were the Hebrew names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise guys of Babylon. So they went to go pray. They're going to sit down and just, this is a time to pray. I think I have this on fairly safe authority that when they prayed, it wasn't in King James. I doubt that they sat down and they first of all said, "Oh dear God," and then a bunch of names before, and then they prayed for all the missionaries in Africa, and after a long time, then they finally got down to the real purpose of their prayer. God, give us some of your mercies here. We need them. But I'm sure that they They went straight into that prayer, and God knew their heart. And it says, and the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. You know, I was listening to Sandy Adams today, and he was saying, if that had been me, if I'd have been in that situation, and I had that kind of pressure on me, and I'd called my friends together, and we need to pray, it would be an all-night prayer vigil. I mean, there ain't gonna be no sleeping tonight because we got to pray. You know, we really need to see God's face here. And he said, and if he had done that, he would have missed the answer to the prayer. And yet he was so confident after having made the request to God and laying it at his feet and believing that God was in charge and that God would do according to his will. Then they took a siesta. And so the secret was revealed in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And the next day he wakes up in verse 20, and he's actually quoting several Old Testament passages here. Which is kind of insightful when you understand that they didn't have Bibles like we do. You know, they had their canon of Scripture, but they didn't have copies. They didn't have 20 different translations on their iPhones and Androids. They didn't carry them around in their back pockets. You know, they weren't as accessible in those days as what they are now. Yet Daniel knew the Bible, and so he says, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever. For wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons, and he removes kings and he raises them up. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and secret things. And he knows what's in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers." You know, God has answered his prayer, and now he's just breaking into this great praise. He says, "I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You've given me wisdom and might, and now have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's demand." And so therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon, and he went and said to him, "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me before the king, and I will tell the king the interpretation." And so then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king, and thus said to him, "I have found a man of the captives of Judah who will make known to the king the interpretation." Now, let me ask a question. What role did Arioch play in this? You know, he says, "King, got good news for you. I've been searching high and low. And I Googled and I did everything. And after much work, I have finally come up with an answer to the dilemma. I found a guy that can interpret your dream." You know, he's trying to take as much of the glory for this as he can. When in actuality, all he did was, Daniel says, "Get me an audience with the king." And so the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. Remember, that was the Babylonian name he'd been given. "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I've seen and its interpretation?" And Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king." Verse 28 says, "But there is a God in heaven." You know, all of these other guys that you've had on your payroll for generations, you know, I mean, they preceded these guys. I mean, this was the Babylonian religion had depended upon these guys for a long time. And it was a very deeply entrenched profession of professional wise guys. And he says, they can't do it. But there is a God in heaven. And I think that there's a solution here for what ails us in this statement of Daniel's. You know, we try to find our solutions, we try to find our answers and find our purpose, and somehow we try to make sense of it all through man's provision, something that man can provide. And yet, no matter how hard we search, no matter where we look and how much we put into it, it always leaves us short. It never does provide. We don't find the answers with man. But there's a God in heaven. And just as Daniel and his friends were able to go to sleep the night before once they had beseeched the Lord, so can we when our situation, whatever thing that we're trying to solve, whatever problem ails us, whatever thing we bring to the Lord and say, Lord, I trust you. You are the God who answers prayers, and here's my situation. Here's my circumstance. Men can't fix this. It's beyond the ability of myself, and so I lay it at your feet. I surrender it. I give it to you because you are the God of heaven. And then we just put a period on that. And then we can go to sleep. He says, there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. In your dream, the visions of your head upon your bed were these. As for you, O king, thoughts came into your mind while on your bed. So he's not only telling him the interpretation of his dream, but he's going to go a little bit further and tell him what he was thinking when the dream was happening. Which I've never known what I'm thinking when my dream's happening. You know, I barely remember my dreams. But Daniel's going to tell him. And he says about what would come to pass after this. And he who reveals secrets has made known to you what will be. As a worldly man. Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar's not a believer. He's a worldly man. He's a pagan potentate, dictator. He was worried about the future. As God's children, as people who, we don't know what the future is going to hold, but we know who holds the future. And as God's children, when we take our circumstances and place them in his care, we don't have to worry about that sort of thing. And he says, but as for me, verse 30, Daniel continues, this secret has not been revealed to me because I have more wisdom than anyone living. It's not because I'm a wise guy, but for your sakes, who make known the interpretation to the king, that you might know the thoughts of your heart. It wasn't because of my fasting. It wasn't because of my entreating. It wasn't because I had 3 very strong prayer warriors joining me in this. It was simply because God wants to answer it. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. The image's head was of fine gold, and its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, and its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. We'll go into a description of these later as Daniel begins breaking it down. So will we. He says, "You watched while a stone was cut without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And then the iron and the clay and the bronze and the silver and the gold were crushed together." So it started, went from the head down to the feet, and then when the destruction happened, it started at the feet and it went up to the head. They were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now remember, most of us, I would presume, are familiar with the story. We know about Nebuchadnezzar's image and this dream that he had dreamed about. But be reading this for the first time, and place ourselves in Nebuchadnezzar's place, as something like this was really causing us a lot of angst. And then here's this man, and Daniel is probably 17, 18, at most 19 years old by this time. And so this little kid is unfolding this for you. This is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings. Not the King of Kings. There's only one of those, but you're a King of Kings. Of all the kings of the earth, you are number one. For God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over all. You are this head of gold. Now, Herodotus, the Greek historian, and he's known for his accuracy in most ways when it comes to this sort of thing. He's very, very meticulous. And he says that the walls were 56 miles in circumference, the main city. There was an outer wall that actually incorporated a lot of the farmlands and stuff like that. But the walls of the city took in 56 miles in circumference. They were up to 320 feet high. That's not supposed to be orange, but that's a tall wall, 387 feet thick. They had chariot races. If you've seen Ben-Hur, picture that on the city wall. They had chariot races running around the city walls. Here's a picture of the Valiant Bank building, over here at Northwest Highway and where I-44 goes across it. And it's about the same height as the city walls of Babylon were, 320 feet. It measured. They haven't really uncovered all of the foundations of it yet. A lot of it has been discovered, but they think that based upon Herodotus and what they've been able to unearth right now, it was 18 miles long and 10 miles wide, and 56 miles all the way around. Here's a map of Oklahoma City. If we could just kind of like superimpose that over it, you can see that the town of Babylon, the city of Babylon, said that it had over 200,000 inhabitants that lived inside the city. Cities prior to this time could not support that sort of population. It was more agrarian. It was more pastoral. And you put that many in the city, there wasn't the economy and the commerce, and there just wasn't the infrastructure to support that. This is pretty amazing. They had hot and cold running water. Over 200 or 2,500 years ago, they had hot and cold running water in the city of Babylon. Here's a picture of Nebuchadnezzar's image, artist's rendition of it. And the head of gold, of course, Daniel says, is Babylon. The kingdom of Babylon only lasted for 70 years, but it was a very powerful empire. The kings of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar was an absolute monarch. When he said, "So let it be written," when he said, "The word has gone out," when he said, "It's all right, I've given the command," it was a command, and nobody could question it. We'll see later when the Persian king had actually enacted a law, and then he says, "And I can't even undo it." He didn't. The Persian kings, even though it was a bigger empire, it wasn't as powerful as the empire of Nebuchadnezzar. And so the next one we'll see, he says, "After you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the earth." The second one is this breast of silver. So this part of the image is going to be made out of silver, which is the Persian Empire, which came in and destroyed the Babylonian Empire. In fact, they couldn't get past those walls, 320 feet tall, almost 90 feet thick walls. So what they did was during a festival, when all the Babylonians were drunk, they went under the walls at the Euphrates River, where the river ran into the city, and they went under the wall and came in while everybody was unawares, and basically took over the Babylonian Empire without firing a shot. And then the third one is the Greek Empire, the thighs of brass. And notice each one of these metals are descending in their preciousness. Brass is not near as precious as gold, and silver is not as precious as gold, but each one of them increase in their strength. Brass is a lot stronger than gold and stronger than silver. And this would be Alexander the Great, the Grecian Empire that lasted for almost 200 years. And then it says, "The fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, and therefore as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, this kingdom shall break in pieces and crush all the others." And this would be the legs of iron, which is the Roman Empire. And all of these metals are actually associated with their corresponding empires. And Rome was the age of iron, and they ruled with an iron fist, and it was Rome, and it lasted. Here I say from 168 to 476. That's when it fell to the Germanic tribes. But if we count in the split that would include Constantinople, it lasted for another 400 years after, or 600 years after that. And so it's a little arbitrary. The dates are a little bit arbitrary. Even the beginning of it is kind of just depends on who you ask. But it says, whereas that's the beginning of the Republic, I would say, was the 168. "Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. And yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile." They're not, clay and iron's not an alloy. You can't mix them together. They're always going to be separate. And the iron is going to be strong, but the clay is kind of, you throw it down, it breaks. And so it's going to be somewhat strong, somewhat fragile, but they shall not adhere to one another, just as the iron does not mix with clay. And so this would be the feet that it's, whoops. This is the feet of iron and clay, which, if we could say, is what most modern scholars have deemed as the revived Roman Empire. We'll go into that as we go through it. It's been through, there's a lot of different, there's 10 toes on the feet. And so, as we're going to see as we go through the book of Daniel, we'll see several other different examples of this. They're going to be repeated in the various visions and prophecies that are given. But this number 10 keeps coming back. And so guys have kind of been somewhat divided as to what they represent. There's been some say that it's 10 Caesars. In the Roman Empire, there was 10 Caesars, and it was a strong empire when it was the Republic, but then when they started doing the Caesar worship and the Caesars became emperors, that it lost its strength. And the problem with that is there were more than 10 Caesars. So then you got the problem of trying to decide which 10 it is. Some say it was the 10 Germanic tribes that came from Europe and came down and basically infiltrated the Roman Empire. They didn't really destroy it. They just kind of took over from the inside. That may be close to, I think, when we start thinking about what the revived Roman Empire represents. It would be the Germanic tribes of Europe. Ostensibly, and some say that it's going to be 10 nations. That's what it says in verse 44. So some sort of form of revived Roman Empire. The problem is what form? What is it going to look like? And for years it's been thought as an attempt that these 10 toes that are the clay and iron trying to mix itself together. Throughout history, there's been several attempts to try to revive the Roman Empire. You had the Holy Roman Empire of the Middle Ages, and then you had guys like Charlemagne and some other guys that tried to take the title of being Caesar. And for years, modern scholarship has thought of this as being some sort of attempt to reunify Europe under one flag and one ruler. Back in 1957, after World War II, there was the nations of the world were kind of concerned. What can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? And so they began the United Nations and so forth. And within Europe, there was an attempt to try to think. The reason why we had this big war is because of the national identities between Germany and France and all this. And if we could just kind of do away with the national identities and have us more of a unified Europe, then we won't have to worry about somebody trying to unify Europe. And so the European Economic Union was formed in 1957 with Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany. This is back when Germany was still divided under the West and the USSR. And from that time, 1957, when the European Economic Union was set up, all evangelical eyes fell upon Europe. This is going to be the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 2 and the other prophecies. In 1967, they changed the name to the European, or it was called the European Community. In 73, they added Denmark and Greenland, but Greenland left a few years later, didn't stay with them. And then they also added Ireland and the UK. They became part of the European Community. And then in 1981, Greece became the 10th nation in the European community. And so all of a sudden there's 10 toes to the feet and iron of clay of the revived Roman Empire, everybody was thinking. But then in 1986, Portugal and Spain were added to it, and that made 12. In 93, it changed the name officially to become the European Union. Today, that's what it's known as, the EU, the European Union. They have their own flag, they have a prime minister, and so forth. They have had their own money, the euro, which hasn't been adopted by all the countries yet, but most of them. In 95, they added Austria, Finland, and Sweden. And then in 04, they added Cyprus. I should say Cyprus. Cyprus wasn't part of the EU. Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Then in 07, they added Bulgaria and Romania. This is after the fall collapse of the USSR. So a lot of the eastern European countries that have been part of the USSR. Now they're joining the EU as well. In 2013, they added Croatia, and now today they have 28 members of the economic or the European Union. So what are they going to do? Fire 18 of them? What are they going to do now? In fact, they still have proposed additions. Turkey is probably not going to make it. They've been pretty much blacklisted. But Turkey, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, and Serbia are still kind of on they've applied. They've filled out their applications, and they're just waiting for approval. Now, here's a map of the Roman Empire in 117 AD, which was probably, that was the largest extent of the reaches of the Roman Empire. And so when we think of some sort of revived Roman Empire, we kind of have that somewhat in view. But notice that it's not all Europe. There's also North Africa, and then there's the Middle East. The European Union today, of course, contains Europe, but it doesn't contain North Africa or those nations of the Middle East. What does all that mean, and how does that fit into things? I don't know. I don't know. 20 years ago, we were sure we knew. 20 years ago, there was no question about it. Have we been kind of going down the wrong rabbit trail in thinking that the European Union is going to be the fulfillment of prophecies to set the stage for the Antichrist, and then we get out of here and the rapture happens? And maybe. I don't know. Maybe it could be something entirely different. The two things, I've shared this many times before, there's two things that I've learned about Bible prophecy. We can look, there's a whole bunch of Bible prophecy in the Bible. About a third of it, almost a third of it, between 25 and 30% of the Bible is prophetic at the time it was written. Of that percentage, the overwhelming majority of it has already been fulfilled. There was a prophecy that was made sometime, the prophecy about Jesus being the Messiah. Well, Jesus is the Messiah, so that prophecy has been fulfilled. Majority of those prophecies have been fulfilled. And two things we can learn from them as we look at fulfilled prophecy in the past. One is that it's always going to be fulfilled literally. Always. Without exception, every prophecy that's ever happened has always been fulfilled literally, never allegorically or metaphorically or symbolically. It's always literal. And secondly, it's hardly ever done with accordance to conventional wisdom. And so the way that all the Bible prognosticators think they got it figured out, ain't got it figured out. After it happens, they go, oh gosh, that was literal, but sure wasn't what we thought. So does that fit into this? I don't know. For some of you, I know that this is kind of like rehearsing things that you know, and I know we got a lot of prophecy freaks in the church and everything, and that's great. That's fine. I kind of consider myself to be one as well. For others, this may be brand new kind of stuff. And for those of you that are this is old stuff to you, this will just kind of maybe reinforce some of the things that you already know and believe. For others of you, you might be thinking, I ain't never heard nothing like this before. Well, one of the things about the book of Daniel is there are, as I was saying, we're going to see a lot of different visions, a lot of different prophecies, and they're going to take different forms, but it's kind of going to be the same thing over and over again. And so what might be overwhelming to you right now, just kind of take in what you can, and then as we go through it each week after week, it might start fitting together more. But here's what I would call a rapture timeline that would kind of show the way things are going to be. The church is right now we are in the church age, which we could establish as being plus or minus a 2,000-year period. We are in what Paul said, the times of the Gentiles. This is the time when God is working primarily through the church, which is primarily comprised of Gentiles. And when the times of the Gentiles is full, as he told the Romans, then things are going to change. And I think that trigger, the thing that will be the significance of that time change, will be the rapture of the church. The time will come when the church will be raptured. We will be taken out of here. As Paul says, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. And that will probably, and we could be off a few months, because when the Bible talks about the 7-year tribulation, it's very specific. 1,290 days, or 1,260 days, in fact. So we don't have to worry about a month or two either way when it comes to it. But probably the rapture of the church will trigger this 7-year period of tribulation. There might be some other things that happen before then, but there'll be a specific 7-year period in which the Antichrist will be revealed. So that's after we're gone, so we don't have to worry about who he is. People say, is he on earth today? I don't know. I don't care. It doesn't have anything to do with me. But the Antichrist will be revealed, and God will be accomplishing 2 things during this 7 years. One is he's going to judge the world for their rejection of Jesus. You know, and we can see that. I mean, that's getting exponential right now. You know, we're the bad guys. The church are the bad guys. And if it just wasn't for us, we could really get progressive and get things done. You know, get those naysayers out of the way. And so God is going to do that. He's going to take us naysayers out of the way, and he's going to spend 7 years of judging the world for their rejection of Christ. Second thing that he's going to accomplish during those 7 years is he's going to remove, Paul says, there's blinders in part put over Israel's eyes at this time. He says in Romans 9. During the tribulation, he's going to remove those blinders, and they will realize that Jesus is the promised Messiah, and they will, through the teaching of the 144,000 that we read about in Revelation chapter 7, they are going to evangelize the world, and the Jews. I don't know that we could say every Jewish person in the world that's alive at that time will get saved, but en masse. I think we could, maybe not in toto, but en masse, the Jewish people will come to a saving knowledge of Jesus. And then Jesus will return at the end of that 7-year period with us, come riding down on a white horse, and will set up his kingdom in Jerusalem, where he will rule for 1,000 years. Now, in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Jesus says, "Now learn this parable from the fig tree." This is Matthew 24, starting with verse 32. "When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer's near. So you also, when you see these things, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you that this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." Now, in prophecy, the fig tree is a type of Israel. And so most of the evangelicals, anyway, are pretty unified in believing that what Matthew 24 is talking about is the nation of Israel, the fig tree, putting forth its branches. And when that happens, you know that summer's right around the corner, and so you prepare for the summer. So Israel, it's interesting that from the time of the Babylonian captivity, essentially, from the time that Nebuchadnezzar first destroyed Judah and Jerusalem and carried them off into captivity, except for a short period in the 2nd century BC. There was a few years where they had a quasi-independence. But Israel did not exist as an independent nation until May 14th, 1948. After World War II, the UN had given this charter where they were going to have this partitioning of Middle East and divide Israel among the Jews and the Arabs that were living in the area. And on May 14th, Israel declared statehood. They declared themselves to be a sovereign state. And so from the time that the fig tree puts forth its leaves and starts sprouting, this generation will not pass until everything is fulfilled. That's what Jesus says in Matthew 24. So from May 14th, 1948, somebody, somewhere along the lines, just kind of arbitrarily decided that a generation was 40 years. It's not a bad number. It's not a bad choice, but they decided that a generation is 40 years. So we're going to go from 1948 to 1988. So before 1988, the church is going to be raptured, and then the tribulation is going to begin. That was the conventional wisdom during that 40-year time period that became kind of increasingly, when Hal Lindsey did Late Great Planet Earth and that sort of thing during the 70s, that's just what everybody was convinced. Well, if Jesus is going to come back in 1988, his second return, where he comes back and sets up his kingdom, we got to back up 7 years for the tribulation, right? So we got to allow for that. So that means the rapture was going to happen sometime before 1981. In fact, most guys believe, because of the way that the Levitical feasts are all prophetic, and they were all, those that have been fulfilled were fulfilled on their feast days, like Pentecost was fulfilled on the day of Pentecost, that sort of thing. That the rapture is somehow associated with Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, which in 1981 was between September 29th and September 30th. And so throughout the 70s, everybody was pretty sure the rapture is going to happen before September in 1981. I got saved November 7th, 1981. If those guys had been right, I'd have missed it by 38 days. And I'd have gone through the tribulation. Most of you wouldn't even been here. You wouldn't even been born. So, on one hand, I guess we can kind of thank God that those guys were wrong, right? I mean, I'm kind of grateful that they, but now I am saved, so bring it, Jesus. Call me home. I'm ready. But what about those that are going to get saved tomorrow and get saved next week? What about those that are just waiting for us to share the gospel with them and to fulfill the fullness of the Gentiles? Because that it's not full yet. But Jesus says when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, then it's all going to change. That'll be the difference in things. So I'm ready. But as Peter tells us in 2 Peter chapter 2, the reason why it hasn't happened yet is because God's not willing that any perish. And the harvest is great. It's ready for the workers, and we just need to be about his business. Well, in the days, this is verse 44, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. Now, has that happened yet? Yes. The king of the church. And so in those days, I was talking with a friend today about Old Testament prophecies regarding us. You know, how many of the Old Testament scriptures regard us? Well, this one does. Because in those days, a kingdom shall be set up. That's the church. It's going to be set up which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. And it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Now, those of the amillennial persuasion, this is the view that all of the book of Revelation is to be taken allegorically, and that there's not going to be some literal rapture and then some tribulation time and then Jesus comes back and sets up his kingdom. All of that's just to be kind of taken figuratively. Those of the amillennial persuasion say that this rock that destroys the feet of clay and iron is the church, that we become the big mountain. The church doesn't destroy anything, okay? Jesus is the mountain. Jesus is the rock. The church is not the rock. Jesus is the rock. Jesus has established the church, and his kingdom shall not be destroyed because he has established it. But we're not the rock. And insomuch as you saw the stone that was cut out of the mountain without hands and then broke in pieces, the iron and bronze and the clay and the silver and the gold, the great God has made known to the king that will come to pass after this. And then he says, I love this, he says, the dream is certain and its interpretation is sure. You know, after Daniel's laying that. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's long hair and curly beard are just getting blown back, you know. I mean, his crown is done blown off his head. He's so blown away by what Daniel, he's just like, I mean, his mouth is agape and his eyes are this big around. And when he's done, and this 18-year-old boy says, and king, you can take it to the bank. It's going to happen just the way it just happened. You know, there have been many failed attempts, as I said, at trying to unify Europe, and I believe by the devil. It's the devil's attempt. He desires to try to somehow thwart. He's just in his stupidity. He's trying to thwart this prophecy and raise up some so that he can set the stage for his man, the Antichrist, to come onto the scene. And throughout history, there's been, you know, even Middle Ages, and as I said, Charlemagne, and then in modern times, you got Wilhelm from Germany. What was the title he took to himself? Kaiser Wilhelm, which is German for Caesar. You know, he saw himself as the fulfillment of that. Hitler, Mussolini, virtually every president since World War II has been pointed at by somebody as being the Antichrist or in some way, shape, or form. But when Daniel says it's been said, it's been written, and it's done, you can take it to the bank. You know, we get kind of excited about prophecy, and I think we should. It's a good thing. I dig prophecy. But it's really nothing more than pre-written history. We could be just as excited about reading history because it's just from God's perspective, from eternity, it's not still future. They're not trying to unfold all these things and figure out these things and count these numbers and divide them by the square root of, they don't care about all that in heaven. It's already happened. So prophecy is just really nothing more than pre-written history. And it says, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel. Old King James says he worshipped Daniel. The word can mean that, but I don't know that's what he did. I'm not sure that Nebuchadnezzar's in that state yet where he's going to worship anybody but himself. But he commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him. And the king answered Daniel and said, truly, your God is the God of gods. He's still a polytheist, but he's the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. And so then the king promoted Daniel and gave him great many gifts and made him a ruler over the whole province of Babylon, which was that was the main part of the Babylonian Empire, was the province of Babylon, and Daniel gets made the governor of it. The chief administrator over all the wise guys, so he's not only governor, but he's the chief of all those guys. And then Daniel also petitioned the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Daniel. So they were like his administration, his cabinet. And Daniel sat in the gate of the king. And he's about 17, 18 years old. Nebuchadnezzar, you would think that he would have fallen down on his face before God with this. You would think that he would have said, tell me how to get saved, Daniel. But as we're going to see, he's not quite ready. He understands. He sees that there is a God in heaven that works in the affairs of men. And he's ready to wrap his brain around that and to embrace that, but he's not ready to surrender to him yet. That's still going to take some more. He's not at that place of humility yet. And sometimes when we share with people and we think, why aren't you getting this? For the very same reason that we didn't until we did. And God had to work on us more. He's going to have to work on Neb more. But his day is coming. Let's pray. Lord, we do bow before you in recognition of you are the revealer of secrets. And we think that is some sort of a great thing, that somehow you could predict something before it happens and even use somebody to declare that, speaking through a human vessel. But Lord, it's no big deal for you. It has already been done in heaven. It's already been settled. It's already happened. And Lord, our calling is not so much to figure it all out as much as it is to be yielded to you in the time that it's being unfolded. And so use us, Lord. Fill us with your Spirit and use us to tirelessly be your vessels in these last days. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Questions or comments?